Hi, welcome to my channel and thank you to my subscribers. If you have not already subscribed, kindly subscribe to my channel. So in this video, we are going to see how to secure AWS ALB using Auth0 as the identity provider. And Auth0 is a widely used identity product, and it was bought by Okta, and so now it's part of Okta, but it is still a very widely used identity provider in the industry. So you can sign up for a Auth0 developer account by just going to this sign up page and signing in using your Google account or Microsoft account or GitHub account, and that will automatically create a developer tenant for you, like how I created here. So I have a developer tenant which I created. So you can create your developer account for Auth0, and in order to configure a AWS ALB and enable HTTP as a listener with a self-signed certificate, you can follow my previous video. I will add the link to this video in the details section, and you can follow this video. And once you complete the configuration that is explained in this video, you should have a AWS ALB with a HTTP as listener. So if I copy this URL and then go to a different browser and try accessing this URL, you will see this kind of a response which actually displays the request headers, the request body, the request parameters, all these details. But currently this URL is accessible in internet, and anyone in any part of the world can access this URL without any authentication. So what we are going to do in this video is add an authentication layer to this AWS ALB URL and use Auth0 as the identity provider, and we are going to use OpenID Connect protocol for this purpose. So in reality, this AWS ALB will be pointing to a backend application, which can be a Java web app or a Node.js or a Python or a .NET. It can be any web application. So what we are going to do is add an authentication layer without modifying the source code, which is one of the greatest features of this ALB. So in order to do that, let's first go to this listeners tab and check the rules of this AWS ALB. So this AWS ALB has one default rule which redirects to a target group, which in turn points to a lambda function, which actually returns this response. But as I said before, there is no authentication layer, so anyone can access that URL. So what we have to do is add an authentication layer to this rule so that only authenticated users can access this application. So before adding the authentication layer, let's go back to the Auth0 console and see how to configure a client application in Auth0. So if you log into your Auth0 console and then you will click this applications menu, you will see a default app which comes with your developer tenant. You can ignore that default app and let's create a new application specific to this OIDC ALB client application. And let's select regular web applications, then click create. So if you go to the settings tab, you will see multiple details like the client application name, the client ID secret, and then we have the callback URLs which we need to configure. We will come back to that at a later point of time. And then you have different settings which you can go through the Auth0 documentation to understand each of these values. As of now, just click save changes, and it successfully created a client application. So we need to do one more step in Auth0. So let's go to the APIs and create a new API. So even though it says API, it's uh, it's uh, it's actually a different concept in Auth0. I can post a different video on what it actually means, but as of now, for this demo, let's just create a API application in Auth0. So it's not like you are building an API application here. You are just configuring API application in Auth0. So you can give any dummy name for this, like what I have given, like awsalb.example.com, and then identifier can be exactly same as the name, and click create. So this will actually create a configuration for the API application. So let's go to the settings, and we need to do a couple of things. So we need to enable RBAC, and we need to add, let's select this add permissions as well, and then click save. So now what we have done is created an application in Auth0, and then created a API in Auth0, and we will see how to use these configuration details in AWS ALB when we enable the authentication layer. So if you go to this applications, there is another new application which got created automatically. When I actually created the API application, Auth0 created a new application here, but you can ignore this. We are not going to use this for this demo. So let's again go back to this OIDC client tab, and let's see what we need to do in AWS ALB to configure this these values. So if you go back to these rules and click this edit button, and if you select this add action, you will see an authenticate option, and by default you will see Amazon Cognito, but in this case we are using Auth0, which is a different identity provider which is not part of the AWS service. So let's select OIDC, and it will ask for details like issuer, endpoint, all these details. So let's see how to get each of these values from Auth0 console. So if you go to this client tab and scroll to the bottom of the screen, you will see an advanced settings panel. Select that and select endpoints. So you have all the values that are required for this configuration except the issuer. So let's see how to get the issuer value. So if you select this OpenID configuration URL, open it in a new tab, you will see issuer value here. So you can copy this issuer value, go back to the AWS ALB screen and copy and paste that value. The remaining values are already available here in this panel. So just copy the authorization URL. It is same as the authorization endpoint. Then you need the token endpoint URL, which is same as the token endpoint. And then you need the user info endpoint, which is same as the OAuth user info URL. And now we need the client ID and secret value. So let's scroll to the top, copy the client ID, and then client secret. So we are done with this configuring, but there are still some additional things that we need to do. If you go to this scope, it by default ALB only requests for OpenID scope, but we need the user profile details and the email address as well in the uh, token. So let's actually add a couple of scopes: OpenID, profile, and email. Just add a space after OpenID, add profile, another space, email. So now AWS ALB will request for OpenID, profile, and email, all these three scopes. And we need to add one additional request parameter. And this is something specific to Auth0. You won't see this in all the other identity providers. Maybe like if you have seen the Okta configuration video, that is totally different. So this is something specific to Auth0. So Auth0 expects an additional parameter in the authorization request called audience, and this audience should be same as the API audience value that we configured in the previous step. So just copy and paste that API audience value, click this tick button, click update. So now if we go back to the screen and refresh this URL, it should redirect to auth0 and display an error. It might take a minute in some cases, but let's give it a try. So it redirected successfully. And you can look at these parameters, the client ID, all these values that we added in the AWS ALB configuration along with the audience. So the error that we are seeing here is redirect URI is not matching, and let's see how to fix this error. So if you go back to this screen and go to the Auth0 application configuration, so we can see this allowed callback URLs. Currently it is empty. Ideally, this callback URL should point to the AWS ALB's callback URL. So let's open the documentation of AWS ALB OIDC and go to this section, prepare to use an OIDC compliant IDP. So here they have mentioned that we need to add a couple of URLs in the client configuration of the IDP. So in our case, we are only using DNS. We don't have a custom domain name configured because we are just using a self-signed certificate. So in this case, we are just going to copy this, go back here and add it. So this DNS value needs to be replaced with the AWS DNS. So go back to this screen, description, copy this DNS name and replace it. So let's save these changes and go to Mozilla and try accessing the DNS again. So now we got this login screen which proves all the configuration is successful. Otherwise it would have again thrown some other error. So let's go back to the Auth0 console, user management, users, and create a couple of users for testing. So let's create a test user one at example.com with some dummy password. And again go back to users and create one more user, test user 2 at example.com with some dummy password. So now we have a couple of users, and let's go back to Mozilla and try logging in using the test user 1 at example.com and the password. Click continue. So now the login is successful and you can see 3 additional tokens in the response, which starts with X-AMZN-OIDC and then followed by access token, data and identity. And now let's analyze one by one token. So if you have noticed, the access token and the data are JWTs, and then the OIDC identity is some kind of a random value. Let's see what these values are actually. So if I copy this access token, which is the very first token, it is a JWT. So let's open jwt.io. And this website is actually maintained by Auth0. So let's try decoding this token. So if you look at this token, you can see the issuer, which exactly matches with the Auth0 issuer. Then we see a value called sub. So what is sub? Subject actually refers to the unique identifier of the user, test user 1 at example.com in Auth0. So let's copy this value and see if we can locate this value in Auth0. So if you select this test user 1 at example.com, and if you look at this user ID value in the top, it's Auth0 pipe symbol 62363 and ends with 1AC21. So if you go back to the screen, so it matches exactly with that value. So I can even do a search and it exactly matches with this user ID. And then you can see the remaining values like what scopes were requested, and then what is the audience value that we passed, awsalb.example.com. And the additional audience value that you see here is something Auth0 adds. You can ignore that. But the key attributes are the issuer, the subject, which is the unique identifier of the user in Auth0, and then the scopes that AWS ALB requested. And let's check the next token, which is the ID token. So if you go here and now if you see the subject, it's exactly same as that same subject, and you see the user's other attributes. Like if you go to the screen, so this user email address is testuser1@example.com. So if you go back here, email is testuser1@example.com. Name is also same as email address. In this case, you can modify it later. Nickname is testuser1. That is basically the same as email address without the domain. So if you go here and if you go to the raw JSON tab, you will see the nickname value here, testuser1. So it exactly matches with what is configured here. So there is one key attribute that if you have noticed here is email verified. So it says email verified is false. So which means this user has not yet verified the email, but that is understandable because I just used a dummy email address. There is no way I can send an email to this dummy email address to verify. If it is a real email address, you can actually trigger an email to that email address, and then when the user clicks that link, Auth0 will automatically change this flag to true. But in this case, it's a dummy email address. So there is one option that we can do is go back to details. If you look at this email, click edit, and you can click this link, set email as verified. So this is just a backend hack just for demo purpose. So now this user's email address is verified. So if I go back here and let's actually try to log in again. So in order to log in again, I need to clear the cookies, and I'm using this plugin, Mozilla plugin, for clearing the cookies. It is a very useful plugin. And after clearing the cookies, if I refresh, it redirects me back to Auth0. Let me log in again. So I got all these three tokens. And let's check this OIDC data token again. So if you look at the old token, email verified is false. Now the email verified changed to true. So this is really useful if you are building your own client application. You can look at the email verified flag. So when a user tries to log in, if the email verified is false, then in your application you can hide certain details, or you can even deny access to the application and throw an error saying please verify your email, and then Auth0 has APIs to trigger email verification, all those things in the backend, and you can integrate your application with those APIs. I just manually changed the verified flag to true for the purpose of demo, but then you can build your own workflows. So now let's go back to this OIDC data, the OIDC tokens. So this OIDC identity, it's actually the unique user identifier of this user, which is exactly same as the subject attribute that we saw in the previous tokens. So you can get the user's unique identifier directly from this header OIDC identity, or you can decode these JWT tokens and get it from the subject attribute. So now let's again clear the cookies and try to log in using the second user, which is testuser2@example.com. So again, I got all those three headers, access token, data, and identity. Let's first check this identity. So if you look at this subject attribute, it should match with the unique identifier of testuser2 at example.com. It exactly matches. So now it proves that I actually logged in using the test user 2 and not test user 1. So let's inspect the ID token. So if I copy this ID token, I can see that same subject. Nickname now shows as test user 2, test user 2 at example.com. Email is test user 2 at example.com, and email verified of this user is false. If you remember, I only changed the email flag for the first user. For the second user, it's still email is not yet verified. That's why it shows pending here. And then the other token, which is the access token, you can again copy that token and view the details. So it will be almost exactly same as the test user one at example.com, except this subject value. So this subject value is the subject of the unique identifier of user 2. So the user 2 at example.com. So this is how you configure Auth0 as the OpenID Connect provider for AWS ALB. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you have any questions, please post it in the comments and kindly subscribe to my channel. Thank you.